Well, welcome back to the last part of this lecture about sampling. I hope that this is making sense and that you're learning a lot about sampling. Please don't hesitate to email me or text me if there's something that's confusing or you want to get clarification or more details on. Okay, so let's start out with sample size. This is a huge question when you're starting your research design. And there's a lot of published guidelines out there that when you get into a research design, you go back and you research what you need for a sample size, and you're able to pull in that so that you've got some credibility and you know what to go with. But there's also some rules of thumb that we use, and that's what I'm going to go through here for you so that you've got a general idea as you're reading. You can always refer back to these and think, oh, that didn't make sense. I don't remember it that that sample size would be large enough for what they're trying to do. So let's go through some of those. You also need to know when you're choosing a sample size the statistical constraints of the analyses that you want to do. And that's going to be more difficult until you know a lot more about different statistical analyses. But that's okay. You can at least use these rules of thumb. One thing that we're always trying to do in research is to have a lot of what's considered power. And you'll remember from a previous lecture that that's the ability that you have to find an effect. And if your sample size is not large enough, you're not going to be able to tease out what that effect could be in your population. So that's important also. So when you ask the question, how big is big enough? Most people will come back very quickly, as many as possible. Yeah, I mean, you're always limited by time and money and effort and availability and different things like that. But you do want a large sample size if you can at all do that. When you're working on correlational studies or causal comparative or true experiments where you've got a control group and you've got an experimental group or you've got different levels of an intervention, you really need to have at least 30 subjects per group. Now, think back to our units of study. If you're going to use a class as a unit of study, you're going to need 30 classes in each group. So you can see how this could really become difficult to do. When you're doing descriptive work, for example, surveys, and you're trying to, find out the risky behaviors that 14 to 16-year-olds participate in, and so you're going to do a survey of the population, you really need 10 to 20%, and I would move more towards the end of the 20% of the population for that kind of work. So, for example, I'm doing work right now on some technology uses or the way that teenagers use technology. And so I know that to really have confidence in what I'm finding as I survey these students, I need to be hitting 20 to even 30% of the population that I'm looking at with these surveys so that I've got confidence in the results. Now, there's something that's not intuitive about this, but just hear me out. The larger your population, you can go for a smaller percentage for a sample size. And that doesn't sound intuitive, but you've got to remember that when you've got a large group of people, there are more people in that group who are similar to each other. So you can actually represent the whole group, the whole population, really well with a smaller percentage of the people. Not a smaller number, but a smaller percentage of your total population. So going back to some rules of thumb here. If your population that you're studying is less than 100, use all of them. Because if you want to generalize, you're just not going to be able to do that well to the whole 100 unless you simply can get as many of them as possible. If your populations that you want to generalize to is around 500, it would be great to use half of them. When you get up into like 1,500 would be your target population, then you should go for a sample of about 20% or 1 in 5. And when your populations get up over 5,000, once you hit those kind of huge populations, you want to go for a sample of about 400 individuals or 400 groups, whatever your unit of study is. There's a chart that we all use in research. It's been around since 1970, and you just end up quoting it in your description of your participants a lot, and you'll see this used a lot. And these are kind of the guidelines that we use. And what you do is you can go down the sample size that's needed for the population, which is in the N column. So I've circled 2 of them here. So if you look down to, if you've got a population of 2,000, a target population of 2,000, you need to sample 322 of them. You need to hit a sample size of 322. Now notice that when you go to 4,000 in your huge population, your whole group, you only need 31 more. You only need 351 subjects to really represent your population really well. Now, as one of the objectives was I wanted you to be able to look at the sampling procedures that are described and think about how that could affect the results that are being reported. So when you do that, go through and identify the sampling method that's being used. They very often will simply say this is cluster random sampling, and you can go back to your notes and remind yourself of what that was. So pick out the sampling method. Then you have to take that method that was used and look at the research problem that the researcher has set up and is trying to answer, the question that the person is trying to answer, and then the results that they say they got. And you have to look at whether that sampling method was then appropriate for the results they're saying, and if it applies to the actual problem they were setting up and trying to do. So if I'm trying to describe the, let me use a different example. If I'm trying to do an intervention of some kind to get 16-year-olds to avoid smoking, one of the known risky behaviors for mid-teens, okay? So if that's the problem that I'm facing and I've got this intervention, and then I use a sampling method that is in a classroom of a teacher I know who's taught health for 15 years, so she's going to let me do this intervention in her classroom. And then I turn around and say my results are that if we will do this with 16-year-olds, they won't smoke, then some red flags should be going off. This problem that I set up was about all 16-year-olds, and yet I've not even selected a group. We don't know if that applies to the general population at all. And so my results are in question. And then you need to go back to the strengths and weaknesses of each method. There is no one best way to do it. If it was a simple random sample, would it have been better to do a stratified random sample or a cluster random sample? Look at table 6.2 in your text and mark that and be able to refer back to it. That will help you a lot when you're looking at strengths and weaknesses. Whenever you're looking at the sampling methods that were used, look for bias. Sampling mistakes and choices that the researcher makes really affect your confidence in generalizing those results. I mean, sometimes you can read an article and you go, well, that's all fine and dandy, but I don't see how that helps us know anything about the general population. So you need to be really, really careful looking for that. Sometimes there's an aspect of the sampling that actually creates a bias. And that's pretty obvious in things like purposeful or convenience sampling. Those are big red flags. to go to my buddy who's the health teacher and do an intervention with her students, that obviously there is some bias on my part that's going to affect my results. That doesn't mean they're terrible. It doesn't mean we can't learn from them. But as a consumer, you need to be waving those red flags in your mind so that you're looking at the results from that perspective. One huge problem in research is when the researcher takes participants from different subpopulations and then assigns them to different treatments. I mean, the most obviously would be if you took all of the males in a group and you assigned them to the intervention, and you took all the females and you used them as your control group. And yet you would be surprised. You can find research out there where they do things that are so obviously introducing sampling bias. The takeaway lesson here is reader beware. Beware of possibilities for bias and the strengths and weaknesses of each sampling type, and whether that sampling really relates back to the way that the question should be answered in the research problem. So when you're going to critique an article, and you're going to be doing this by the end of the semester, so pay attention to this part. As you look at the sampling procedures, which will be part of your final project for this class, you're going to have to look at the sampling that was done in your research article. Look, first of all, at how well the participants are described. You want to know as much as you can about those participants that relates to what's being studied. So if ethnicity wouldn't make any difference in the study, don't worry about it. But if age of the participants would, then that better be described. Your population, the target population that the researcher wants to be able to generalize to, needs to be defined. And the more specific, the better, because then you can be either confident or not confident that that sample represents that population. Look for the description of the sampling procedure. Did the researcher even really know what he or she was talking about or how they did their sample? And it will amaze you when you read some of these research studies that why in the world did the person do it this way? Were they even aware of different procedures? Look for the adequate sample size, and you've got some tools now and some rules of thumb that you can use to when you look at these through a critical eye. One thing about surveys should have their return rate listed, and it should be well into the 60% range if you're going to have a lot of confidence in it. And a really, really good researcher will actually explain to you the demographics or the details about the people who did respond and the demographics of the part of the group that wouldn't respond. And you can look and see if there's any trend there or something. Did all the 14-year-olds answer, but the 15-year-olds just poo-pooed it and didn't pay any attention to it? And then look for possible bias. The bottom line is that every step along the way you question, are there characteristics that were not considered or described that could affect the results and how confident I can be in them? At this point, I hope you're thinking about some of these polls that we hear about on the news or some internet sites you might have seen. And don't you wonder sometimes when you hear these things, where in the world did they find these people who answered that way? Who are these people? I think of the Jay Leno skits with the man on the street and the questions they would ask. And, they'd go to the mall and ask questions. And was that the right place to really find people who would actually know answers to those questions? And, of course, he made fun of it, and it was a lot of fun. But think about, like there are websites where people can go on and rate their school, or product ratings, even the stars we give products on Amazon. now started doing research on some of these trends, and it's really interesting to see that people tend to go in and give their opinions when they feel really strongly one way or the other. People tend to be either very angry or very happy, and then they're willing to rate something. The ones who are in the middle and just content and they're not raving about it, they don't usually take the time. And there's some interesting research starting to come out of this. So there's some definite bias there. So the next time you're listening to the news, especially during political season, and they tell you about a poll, you should be questioning at this point, where did they find these people and how did they choose? Well, the next steps then are, I've attached some sample articles in Web Campus. And they're just I just pulled out the sampling procedures or participants section so that you could read those. And take the time to read them and look at your notes as you read them and go through and make sure that you're comfortable with what each author said and kind of where it aligns with this lecture. Then you're ready to participate in response number 5 in the discussions. So I look forward to seeing your comments.